and environmental justice. And our Centres for Research Excellence are, in short, all about multidisciplinarity and about work within and without our university, and about thinking about what it is to be thoughtfully for, in, and of the world. So responding to global challenges, those of, not least those of war, poverty, and racism, which are actually enshrined and inscribed around our statue of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which is not very far away from where I'm sitting today, and comes from a speech he gave here at the university back in 1967. But I think, of course, very pressingly today in 2021, climate change and the related issues of migration. Cultural heritage is at the centre of so much of this debate, from sites of conflict to issues of climate justice, from Syria. And of course, yesterday was the 10th anniversary of the Syrian uprising, and the continued impacts and displacements of that are very much on my mind. From Afghanistan to China to Western Australia, these issues are playing out every day. Indigenous and First Nation rights, the role of memory, of narrative, of storytelling, and of interpretation in that are vital. From battles over mining interventions in traditional communities and sites, to the marking of democratic protest in Myanmar, to Damascus, we are all finding the ways we need to describe and to discuss and to collect and to curate these issues. So creative practice is important, and just yesterday in Cambridge, Issam Kurbaj, fantastic artist, was doing a live streamed event in which he was rewriting the graffiti of young teenage protesters from Syria, and he then burnt that piece of work, and those charred remains will now be put into a glass display in Cambridge, a site of conscience in itself, I think. I briefly mentioned social and environmental justice as one of our university core values, and that sits alongside equality, diversity and inclusion and academic freedom, and all of those interrelate in very important ways. And so for all those reasons, I'm just delighted to welcome you to the event, but I'm also very attentive to the learning and to the challenges that will be the outcomes of this workshop. It's wonderful to have university colleagues, students here alongside global partners from social justice and human rights-based organisations. You are all very welcome. And I look forward to hearing about the conversations. I'm very sorry that I can't stay for all of them. I have to go off and have my regular COVID-19 testing before I attend another meeting this afternoon, but I will hear Chris and Linda do their introductions. So I'll end with the words of somebody who inspired me very much, Barry Lopez, an environmental writer and campaigner who died at the end of last year. And I thought of his words in thinking about this workshop and its purpose today. Conversations, he says, are efforts towards good relations. They are an elementary form of reciprocity. They are the exercise of our love for each other, and they are the enemies of our loneliness, our doubt, our anxiety, and our tendencies to abdicate. To continue to be in good conversation over our enormous and terrifying problems is to be calling out to each other in the night. If we attend with imagination and devotion to our good conversation, we will find what we need. Someone among us will act. It doesn't matter who, and we will survive. So thank you for starting and continuing those good conversations, and for the actions that will and must follow. And on that, I'll thank you again and hand back to Chris and Linda.
Thank you so much, Julie. What a great quote from Barry Lopez to start us off with. It's been an interesting, long road to this conversation. And it started actually over a conversation in Mexico between Chris and I. Last year, the last trip I got to take anywhere was to Newcastle, where I had a chance to meet all of you Newcastle folks, many of you Newcastle folks, and begin to learn about your work. And then we, Chris and I, along with Joanne from the Center for Heritage and Braden Painter, my colleague at the Coalition, have continued to kind of deepen these lively conversations, which we're now so excited to you. We'll, like I said, have some provocateurs, well, big group, small group. But Chris, I want to give you a chance to kind of frame a little bit about what we'll be talking about from your perspective as well.
Thanks, Linda. And thanks, Julie, for the really heartfelt and inspiring words that are, really so strongly aligned with what we're trying to achieve here. So this is an event that comes out of, I think, Newcastle University and the International Coalition for Sites of Conscience, identifying areas of common interest, really around the political and emotional and social significance of sites and moments of historic suffering of different kinds, and what the legacies of those are, such as continued intergroup tensions, violences, even denials, and how we can actually engage with the past in the present in pursuit of peace, in pursuit of civility, care for the world and for one another. And then the second part of that, in a sense, is what we can do and what is our agency and what different kinds of institutions can do collectively together that wouldn't be possible as single actors. So that's the other challenge that we're setting ourselves here. And I think that this workshop is one manifestation of how we actually try to work through that. How can we as institutions work together for all of the kinds of lofty ideals that I was talking about just now? And this is part of an exploratory discussion. So we're bringing together in this meeting academics from Newcastle University, many of whom work on related issues, as we'll hear from, coalition staff, Linda and Braden, who are here obviously, as well as member organisations from within the Coalition of Sites of Conscience to begin to test this out. The other constituency that I want to mention here is that we're also running some virtual internships with the coalition. So we have a number of students and recent graduates who are undertaking research projects that sit between the different interests of between the shared interests of the coalition and the university. If any of you interns feel like giving a wave, then please go for it. Okay, I can see a few. I'm on two screens, so it's a bit hard. So the format today is a bit unusual, especially for us academics who like to indulge ourselves sometimes with long talks. Everything that we do, all of the interventions and discussions are going to feel really brief, but I think that's probably a good thing for us to be a little bit out of our comfort zone. And that's, I think, what we're trying to do in terms of designing a really good cross-sectoral discussion here. The purpose of this ultimately is to help us think about how we can develop a really enduring partnership across lots of vectors, really, from networking, how we can think about this in relation to research, education, engagement, impact on policy and practice, and addressing the kinds of global social justice and environmental justice questions that we've been talking about and that Julie sort of characterized so well for us. So that's what we're doing today. Linda has already posted the agenda there, so you can see that we'll be having some provocations around key questions and then discussions there. Linda, is there anything you want to add to that I've missed out?
No, I realized that in fact, I did not do my 2-minute introduction to the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, which perhaps I should. Julie did such a great job about the university, and I was like, oh, I just launched in, which is not so surprising for me. For those of you who don't know us, the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience is a global network of more than 300 museums, historic sites, and memory initiatives in more than 65 countries around the world, lots of whom are here today, who believe that we can create a more just future by using the tools of the past. And so we are a network, which is to say we are not a prescriptive organization, but our work as the coalition is really bringing together the knowledge, skills, and connections to do the work that all of our members and other people around the world are doing. So we are conveners, we are conversation makers, we are skill builders, and we do all those things. We have 3 programmatic units, of which Braden and I in methodology and practice are one. There's our Global Networks program, and our global initiative for truth, justice, and reconciliation, which may be of interest to some of you who work in peace building or other aspects of work at the university. So that really briefly is what we do. So I just wanted to add that, Chris. And I think because our schedule is tight, I'm already gonna deviate from the agenda. We wanted to give you a little time in small groups to introduce each other, but I think we're gonna plunge right in to our first group of provocateurs. These two sessions today have two coalition members and two university faculty who we've asked to address some particular questions. So I think without further ado, we'll dive into our first four, which I'll introduce kind of as a group together, and then we'll take them in order. Lebo Marashane is from Constitution Hill in South Africa, one of the kind of quite amazing sites of conscience that is both a former prison and a site of conscience and the home of the nation's Supreme Court. So there's a lot of things happen at Con Hill, which Lebo will share about. Lisa Lee is one of the few people I know who's actually been director of two sites of conscience, Jane Addams Hull House, and now the National Public Housing Museum, both in Chicago in the US. Ian Watson is director of the Tyne and Ware Archives and Museums, which is across the street for many of you. But for those of you who aren't in Newcastle, it's the museum in Newcastle. And Francesca Lanz is the Maria Sklodorowska, I don't even know how close I got there, Curie Fellow at Newcastle, who I know has been doing some really interesting work about different kinds of institutions. So we've asked everyone to respond to the question, from your perspective, what is at the heart of a site of conscience? So Lebo, I'm gonna begin with you.
Thank you, Linda. Good afternoon, everybody. As already being introduced, I'm from South Africa, Constitution Hill. And I think, this is a big question. What is at the heart of a site of conscience? And I say this because in our experience, we've seen that that definition actually evolves. And I hope to do justice in explaining how in the context of Constitution Hill. When we were set up, we were declared as a site of memory, which translates to us being a site of conscience, basically because that's where past atrocities happened. We were a prisoner that held political activists of the time during the apartheid. So when declared a site of memory, it was to memorialize those atrocities, but also to acknowledge the South African past. We did that launching campaigns and programs that seek to build social cohesion throughout the country. That mandate has changed completely. That agency has been changed by the new generation. I would say post 94, which is when we had our democratic elections, at the core of the nation was to build a nation, social cohesion, programming focused on that. Entered 2015, the agency changed. The new generation wanted to push the agenda of social justice, which is what the Constitution had promised. So I would say, in as much as we are a site of conscience, a place of memory where we begin to get communities to come and reflect, engage with the history through various programs, we have found that we needed to relook at that definition, but also relook at how you deliver your programming. Does it tie with what communities require at that time? Pre-2015, issues were different. Communities wanted to speak about the history, re-engage about what had happened during the TRC, the Truth and the Reconciliation period. So we offered that space of reflection, of memory, of engaging with the history that had occurred. But we had to change that drastically when 2015, an incident of xenophobia sparked social unrest, social discord. Programming had to change to respond to those issues. How do you begin to then respond to this new social discord? At the heart of it, it was economic issues, people not being able to access jobs. Those are the real issues. People not wanting to hear about so much about the history. There is appetite to learn about it, but pressing issues are that how do you then begin to address issues of immigration, migrants, refugees? So for me, as a site of conscience, you need, at the heart of it, it is memory. It is space of reflection, of engaging with those issues. But at the same time, how do you evolve? How do you become relevant? Because also history requires us to be that flexible. You can't be walls and objects and only that, bricks and mortar. How do you engage with the community and how do you become that kind of evolving consciousness, engaging with your community? Yeah, I'll pack it there. I think I've exhausted my time probably.
Oh, I have to say, we gave our speakers tight time limits, and Lebo, you are within 2 seconds under of your time limit. So you have set us off perfectly in so many ways. Ian, I'm going to go next to you, and then Lisa, and then Fran. So Ian, unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thanks very much, Linda. Good afternoon and good morning, everybody. So for me, it's about human rights and or civil rights. It can be about an individual or a group, a movement or a section of society. Even if it's about an individual, the issue is bigger than that individual. So in the UK, we're reeling after the alleged murder last week of a woman walking home from a friend's, apparently by a serving police officer. Police have been heavily criticised for the way they intervened in a peaceful vigil at the site just this weekend, increasing the power of this as an unofficial, if you like, site of conscience. And the point of this is it's not just the tragic death of this one woman, but it's about the safety of all women in our world. The definition of sites of conscience talks about place. And for a moment, I want to dwell on place. There's something special about place, what the Romans called genius loci, the spirit of the place. And very interestingly, we have a new Arts Council strategy, which encompasses museums in England. And that strategy published last year emphasizes for the first time place, that link from people to places, to communities, to nation. People have a special connection to place. Reconnecting is important for identity. It's important for mental health. Place defines your identity. Almost the first 2 questions you ask when you meet somebody are, what's your name and where do you come from? Sites of conscience can also be about the potential for something wrong to happen. So I was thinking of the Women's Peace Camp at Greenham Common in Oxfordshire, which began in the 1980s. Now that could be seen as a site of conscience because women camped there, experienced hostile treatment because they wanted to protest not about something that had been done, but against the suffering which could be done if the nuclear weapons housed there were actually used. So for me, bound up with sites of conscience, they're a place. There are stories, which includes memories and what might conventionally be called history. It's a whole other discussion as to what is history. We haven't got time for that one here. So it's place, it's stories, and it's objects. As somebody who works in museums, that tactile, haptic experience of objects, I think is very, very fundamental. There also needs to be something to keep the memory alive, a memorial, a museum, a heritage centre, a programme of activity that tells the story of the place, or a work of art perhaps, as in Berlin's memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. It can only be a place of conscience, a site of conscience, when people know about it and engage with what happens. Just like a museum, if nobody visits that museum, there is no point in having it. We need people to engage with it, and therefore we need things to happen there. A place of conscience, a site of conscience, can capture a moment, a single unlawful killing, or something which happened over a long period of time, like sites associated with the slave trade. And although the terminology of sites of conscience is new, the concept is not. So as a historian, I was thinking about the murder of Thomas à Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, in his cathedral in 1170 AD, 850 years ago, killed by 4 knights on behalf of the then king, following a dispute between secular and religious power. His shrine became a place of pilgrimage. 4 years later, the king under whose authority the murder had taken place walked barefoot to the Canterbury Cathedral in penance. Finally, and I think there's about 20 seconds left. So I was aware of when Aristotle talked about the unities of time, of place, and of action. And those seem to be very, very relevant in terms of sites of conscience. Something there is captured that has a unity of time, a unity of place, and a unity of action. And I hope to discuss and explore this a bit more in the next session. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ian. And Lisa.
Hi, Linda, and hi, Braden. Thank you so much for your work, and I'm so happy to be with you all and my colleagues from other sites. Today, I am talking to you from Chicago, a city whose name is derived from the Algonquian name, which means river with shores lined with wild lakes. And Chicago is home to many indigenous nations, including the Three Fires Confederacy. And following the settler violence culminating in the Black Hawk War of 1832 and 1833 Treaty of Chicago, many indigenous people were forcibly removed from these territories or killed. Over a century later, under a different set of government policies called the Indian Relocation Act of 1956, many indigenous nations found themselves once again coerced to move, but this time back to the urban centers where their ancestors were originally dispossessed. Today, Chicago has the 3rd largest urban Native population in the US, with more than 65,000 Native Americans in the greater metropolitan area. And as a museum professional, telling the story of forced migration and displacement of public housing residents, I strive to understand this other violent history and honor this place we inhabit and the land the museum is on. So my grandmother never had any formal education. And she was also one of the smartest people that I ever knew. And she used to always say to all of her grandchildren, I love you each so much, but each of you is like a finger on my hand, all different but important and all better together. And so she never really talked about how much she loved us with her heart, but she always talked about us as each of her fingers. So I'm going to talk maybe a little bit about the fingers of the sites of conscience. As Linda mentioned, I've been the director of 2 sites. One, the Jane Addams Hull House Museum, which serves as a dynamic memorial to social reformer Jane Addams, the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and also her colleagues whose work changed the lives of their immigrant neighbors. And then also now at the National Public Housing Museum, in the last remaining building of a 1937 housing project, which is also the Jane Addams homes by chance. And we are dedicated to preserving, interpreting, and propelling the right of all people to a place to call home and creating a world where housing is a human right. Perhaps the most important part of being a site of conscience to me is a fierce, unrelenting insistence and belief that in order to solve today's most pressing social issues, we have to go back in time, and that we will not be able to preserve history and make memories and histories meaningful if we do not link this history to issues that people are facing today. In order to do this, we have to acknowledge violent amnesias that would have us selectively forget certain histories, but we also have to remember the stories of struggle and resistance. And as a site, it is so important to tell the stories of oppression and pain and suffering and all that we struggle against, but also the stories of love, happiness, and collective joy and all that we struggle for. This motto by John Berger is always taped to my desk as a kind of mantra. Never again will a single story be told as if it is the only one. And it is also something that many activists and writers have always addressed, what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie calls the danger of a single story. And so at the Jane Addams Hull House Museum, we told the story of her being a Nobel Prize winner, but also the fact that she was considered the most dangerous woman at one point. We also not only told the story of Jane Addams, but we also told the story of Mary Kaiser, who was the housekeeper who cleaned the Hull House settlement. And so now at the National Public Housing Museum, although the story that we are dedicated to telling is the story of public housing residents, and we have an oral history archive that does this work, We also want to link to other public housing denizens who, for example, are people who are incarcerated in the United States, which is the largest form of public housing in the United States, the one which we are most invested in as a carceral nation state. And so the work that we do must always be making connections between these different stories, important to challenge mainstream narratives, but always uncovering the story which we think is not yet told. Cool, that's me.
That's inspiring you, Lisa. Thanks so much. Fran, you're next.
Okay, so I think that many of the points that I wanted to talk about have been already covered by the previous speaker, but it may seem an obvious answer, but I really think, and also your talk reinforced this idea that at the heart of the side of conscience, there is their core mission that they declare to be a safe space to remember. And what is also very interesting is to enable visitors to make connections between the past and the related contemporary human rights issues. But however, I believe that what distinguishes a side of conscience really is how they do what they do. And in my perspective, this has a lot to do with where they do what they do. So probably because I'm an architect, so my answer may be a little bit, partisan. But I really think that the point that sites of conscience are place-based institutions, most of them. And in many cases, they work in a site that is a site of contentious memory and sometimes also painful memories, is what really makes them really powerful. And this idea of the power of the place and the idea that they provide people with a way of remembering, but it's a very special way, very different way of remembering. It's very very embodied, is made of emotions. They work in places that are very evocative and very strong, very complex also, and very layered, because I think that many of these sites are really places where different layers of memory, but also physical traces are intertwining. And this makes, and they are also places where a lot of political, social, and memory load is charged. So that they can be places also where different experience can compete and collide. So I think that really at the heart of a side of conscience, there is this special way of working with the place and people and emotion and affect, and different way of remembrance that are created by a very specific kind of relationship with the place. So this also links back to the idea of Ian, of the idea of engaging with memory in many ways, also a very physical and embodied and an emotional way.
Great. Thank you, Fran. And thank you all four for starting us off in such interesting ways and so much to think about. But we want you all to have a chance to share your thoughts as well. So we're going to break you into small groups, give you 10 minutes or so to ponder this question on your own. We have one Spanish speaking group. We've put Spanish speakers together to make it easier because translation is not possible in breakout rooms. And it's a great chance to meet some new people. We have mixed you up so you won't just be talking to the people you already know, because we don't believe in that. So Braden, do you want to break people out?
Great. Everyone should see a pop-up inviting you to a small breakout room. Go ahead and accept that and we'll call you back. Let's see. All right, Yassine and Alexandra and Daniel. What can we do to help you get to your rooms? Did you all see
Alexandra's in the
pop-up?
wrong meeting altogether. So
Yes, I guess, but I'm sorry, I mixed up because we have two colleagues, Natasha and me, and we received the one link, and I guess that I'm in the wrong meeting. Is it possible?
So you want to go to the Europe meeting, yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, exactly.
That's not this meeting.
Yes, exactly. And how to move there?
I will email you a link.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank you.
sure.
Sorry for this.
No, no worries.
No, you're good. There are multiple things going on. Yeah. And Yassine, are you there? Yassine, can we help you? Linda, can you also pause the recording right now?
Okay, everybody, sorry, restarting. It looks like everybody had a chance to chat with at least someone in their rooms. I know rooms were a little small, and I hope there was lots of great conversation. Keep those thoughts, and as always, if it raised questions or thoughts you want to share with the group, please feel free to use the chat room as well. We'll kind of circle back to them towards the end of the day. But we have another question for our team of four. Lebo, we're going to start with you again. Can a site of conscience of contested memories provide a space for future action? So, Lebo, it's all yours.
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, I think that question actually fits the predicament that Constitution Hill finds itself in. Having emerged from a painful history of apartheid in South Africa, we are having to deal with contested histories, but also a nation that is battling to come together. I know that globally, South Africa is known for its progressive constitution, and also it's held highly in terms of advancing human rights. But we find that about 27 years into a constitutional democracy, we are having to continuously engage about our history. There are challenges in terms of, for lack of a better word, I'll term those that you would call perpetrators and survivors coming together to agree on what had occurred in terms of history. There are narratives that are still contested. There are stories that are still disputed. And one finds it difficult because South Africa went through the process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where people came forward to tell stories and to tell the truth in a bid to reconcile. There are still those that are missing. We still don't know where others are. There still are histories that are not recorded, where issues such as rape that was perpetrated against women as a weapon of war are not recorded. And women are coming forward to tell those stories. As a site of conscience, we record those narratives, but those that were allegedly involved in those acts are equally coming forward to dispute them. So in terms of shaping our history, we're having to balance. It's a balancing act. We, like the previous speakers have said, are not wanting to tell a one-sided story. We are for everybody to come forth and tell their story. And how this is shaping the history of South Africa, we're finding that it's very important to continue speaking. It's important to continue engaging in the history and not close it off and say TRC had occurred, history was recorded. It's an evolving process. it does not end. And narratives are continuously contested, and they shape how we engage with the public. We have had to devise forums where people can come through. Some would just want to come and not have their stories, their narratives recorded, but just as a space of reflection. One who was a perpetrator in the apartheid era came forth to say, I had killed so many people and I'd want to confess and not be recorded. So it's a very precarious environment that we find ourselves in, but it's a space where we don't judge and we don't take sides. We are having to listen to those narratives and do what communities that are coming forth request us to do. So in terms of how it shapes the history, it also has forced us as a site of conscience to be open to various voices, to be open to various narratives, but to also chat programs that can begin to engage communities, encourage people to come forth and interact with one another. Because we don't want a situation where we find people being polarized, because at the moment, that's what keeps happening. When you have programs that seek to bring together groups in a form of a social cohesion or nation building, your audience begin to identify themselves as only survivors or only perpetrators. That's another challenge that has come through that we've had to deal with, and design programming that begins to depolarize that as we want to build social cohesion among South Africans. I don't know if do I still have time, Linda?
No, I think we're good. So can we, it was really great and so much to think about. Ian.
Thanks, Linda. I wanted to start with a slight challenge to the question. And my challenge to the question is the phrase contested memory. Quite a number of my colleagues here in the UK are asking that we don't use phrases like contested memory, like contested heritage, because that implication implies there is something less good about that memory, about that heritage. And we should say heritage, we should say memory, and acknowledge that it is all our past and that it is all there. So just to make that point as I start. But for me, what really lies behind this, I think, is whether you believe that history is dead, that history is bunk, that it belongs only in memorials and history books, that the events of the past are so specific they can't be relevant to what happens now or in the future, or that history is a living narrative, that it can teach us about the present and the future. And for me, it very, very much can. And I've devoted my life to history on that basis, that it is what we can learn. And in thinking about this, I was really interested in thinking about the controversy that followed the revised proposal from the International Congress on Museums, ICOM, when it launched its new proposed mission in Kyoto a couple of years ago. And the phrases there were, museums are democratizing inclusive and polyphonic spaces for critical dialogues about the pasts and the futures, acknowledging and addressing the conflicts and challenges of the present. And to me, this acknowledgement of addressing the conflicts and the challenges of the present is something important and fundamental. It's the next step for taking that action in the future. And there it's applying to all museums, not just sites of conscience, which I think is something really, really powerful. So going to my own experience around this, after the election of President Trump 4 years ago, there were significant demonstrations in Newcastle, particularly with reference to the immigration policy that we heard about coming from Trump. And we collected some of the material associated with those protests. We displayed it in the museum. We didn't actually contextualize it. There was an implicit judgment around that, an implicit non-neutral judgment, but we didn't make that non-neutral judgment explicit. However, it led to a visit from a far-right extremist group into the museum. They came in, they brought their placards into the museum, photographed themselves about the museum, then posted on their Facebook pages. There were two things that really stick out from what they posted on their Facebook pages. One was saying museums are about art and history, they're not about the present. which I fundamentally don't agree with, but that was their attitude. And the second one was they posted some, you know, really hostile and provocative things like, "We know where you live." So that implicit threat that if you keep doing this, we are going to do something to you, we are going to threaten you in that. So clearly, by highlighting those issues around immigration, and in our view, the positives around immigration, why we would wanted to support that and support our diverse communities, we were making people think. In this case, we'd reached perhaps the people who don't normally come into museums, who don't normally engage with some of that debate. And you know, we haven't found a way yet of taking that forward powerfully. But I think the reason that we did this work and we got involved this work was on the basis of creating Destination Tyneside, which colleagues in Newcastle University have done some research into. And that is probably the first permanent display in a UK museum dedicated to immigration rather than emigration, and telling the story of how that works and how that's helped us build a very sort of diverse community on Newcastle, and a place-based community with many of the sites that people first came to live in the city, very, very close to the museum. So that was my powerful personal experience of how the memory and the past and those stories are still active, and that history isn't bunk. The challenges that people have lived with in the past are very often the same challenges as we're living with now. So we really do need to look at those and to learn from them and use those stories in our contemporary narrative. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian, so much. And it's the kind of personal relevance of that story is really great. So thank you for sharing it. Lisa.
All right, great. Yeah, I love that. One of my favorite quotes is by Faulkner, where he says, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." And so it reminds me of that. So I am teaching a museum and exhibition practices class now, and the kind of golden rule of good exhibits is that they teach us to think, feel, and act differently. And that knowing is not just about historical facts, but also as sentient beings about affect and emotions. And finally, about praxis, the dialectic of thought and action. And one of my favorite quotes is by Max Horkheimer, the Frankfurt School philosopher, who always insisted that thinking is the first act of resistance. So like, I also want to maybe contest the question a little bit that Linda posed to us, because I think it's so important to not create a dichotomy and reinscribe a kind of dualistic thinking between thinking, memories, and action. And at the National Public Housing Museum, one of our most important programs, one that I mentioned earlier, is building this oral history archive, where we are gathering the stories of public housing residents and also people who are committed to housing. But our programs link arts, culture, and public policy. And we do this by insisting that there is a literal, a metaphorical, and also etymological connection between the act of storytelling, which is the giving of accounts, to activism and holding people morally responsibility, which is about accountability, and also the work of public policy, which is about the keeping of accounts, the sort of question of power and where resources, like literally like accounts and money, are being allocated in our communities. And so the work that we do with the Oral History Archive is sort of using these stories of lived experience to inform creative public policy. And one of the things that I think is really important that has been raised by the previous speakers is this question about, like, can you do this work and be a political organization and take a stance? And I might differ a little bit from Lebo's in conversation many years ago with Bonita Bennett, who was the director of District 6 Museum. And she was talking to me about the sort of 4 different truths that were defined by the TRC. And this idea that we must acknowledge at our sites that there's kind of forensic truths, like the actual historical facts that we should insist on. And that there's also narrative truth, which is the individual truths and memories that people have of an event or of their own personal experiences, but that there needs to also be dialogic truth, which is when these 2 different truths sometimes comes into conflict one another, but that the most important work of a site of conscience is then restorative truth, which is how do we create a space where all of these truths are acknowledged and we move forward. And there is a kind of insistence that I have as a museum professional that we must take a stance, that, you know, to quote Arundhati Roy, you know, once you've seen it, you can't unsee it, and to do nothing is as a political act is doing something. And so I guess, you know, one of the questions for me as we sort of move forward is like, how much can we as individual sites insist that, for example, there is global warming, that genocide is bad, that, you know, we should be advocating for immigrants' rights. And this is all sort of part of one big continuum, and that in order for us to become sites of action, we must become political sites and take a stand.
Hey, thank you, Lisa. I am so happy to have people push back on my questions. So thank you, Ian and Lisa. That was part of the, actually part of our goal was to really have this kind of conversation. Francesca.
Okay, so probably what I didn't say is that I'm currently researching on former asylums converted into museums. And I recently did some interviews with former visitors. And so this question, I don't know why, I just focused on the action in terms of what visitors, what people will do after, which kind of action a site of conscience would invite them to do. And I think that what I noticed is that many of the people, basically all the people that have visited this kind of sites, were so much involved and touched and also personally involved in the stories and the experience, that they felt the urgency to do something. But this was a very spontaneous action. Many of them started to, for example, open discussion on social media about mental health care. What do we know? What do we know about it? They try to bring more people to the site, so they offered themselves to be guide for other friends. So, I mean, this desire to talk, I think, is an action. Just inviting people to do something, to talk, to discuss, to confront about what their experience, what they heard at the site, is action, and it's something that is very important. It's something that the site of conscience can do. However, what I also noticed is that sometimes it's not really the action that the museum would expect, because there was disagreement. Some visitors disagreed strongly with the kind of statement that the museum was doing about mental health in the past and today. So also the action was a reaction and an opposition. So I think it's also very interesting not to ask probably if there is space for future action, but which kind of action and from whom, and how the museum can also engage with these people after they visit, and what can be built out of these actions. So as a kind of chain of actions, reaction and actions. So I think that this is something very interesting, and I would love to hear also from you about your experience of disagreement and the action that comes from the disagreement with the museum.
Okay. Wow, 4 great points of view and conversations. And as before, we're going to split you into groups and give you about 10 minutes to contest the question. Lisa, you look like you had a question. No? Okay, sorry. We're going to split you into groups again to give you some time to contest the contested question, to talk about what you think action is, basically, again, to continue the conversation around whatever is raised from this 4 set of responses. So Braden, you want to break people?
All right, the room should be open again. And we'll call you back. Pause the recording, Linda.
Thanks.
We were talking about sites and the meaning of sites, but we didn't really talk through the word conscience. Why the use of the word conscience, and what does it mean to be designated a site of conscience specifically, as opposed to a site of memory or a site of history? And that's a question rather than we don't have a response.
Really interesting. Sometimes we end up being called sites of consciousness, and that's always a little confusing as well. That's a great question. I'm going to leave it, or if other sites of conscience members want to take a stab at it. Other reflections from your conversations, anybody?
Can I just jump in, Linda, really quickly? I think that's such a good question, Catherine. And, you know, especially because there is so much debate in the academy also about place versus site. And like this thing, the important thing I do think is this question of why is it a site of conscience? And maybe something that I was saying earlier about how we link the storytelling and the memory to sort of moral accountability and this sort of call to action, you know, that is part of the work, right? So it's not just a place to warehouse, like this contemporary idea that museums are not just places to warehouse and preserve objects. I don't want to just be a museum that warehouses memories, you know, but that there needs to kind of be a call to action and a push for moral accountability, which is where the idea of conscience comes in, perhaps. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. Other thoughts from this morning? Or afternoon, sorry, whatever time it is, wherever you are.
In our group, we talked a bit about how useful Lisa Lee's 4 truths were. We didn't realize those were used as part of the training for the sites of conscience. So that was something that we as academics learnt, and how interesting those 4 truths are in kind of separating out some of the messiness and difficulties when you're dealing with histories which are often contested and challenged. But the idea of the forensic truth at the bottom of a lot of this, which, you know, is really important at the same time. So just so that we found that really useful and interesting.
A core part of our work, yeah, for a long time, I think, right, Lisa and Braden, the familiar territory. Anybody else? Other thoughts? But it's great to hear the intersection, Joanne. Thanks. Other thoughts?
I mean, I guess one thing that did come up was also that contested can be a positive thing, right? That the dialogue is being opened up, and that maybe you don't want to, like we were talking a little bit about how contested sites might have a lot to do with national history and how you're engaging with writing or rewriting or rethinking your history. So we were saying, you know, that in the UK, it's obvious that what is happening right now in the public sphere is a deep rethinking of national history, the role of empire, the role of slavery, the role of race and racism. And so maybe in different sites, you want to have a different kind of conversation around contestation according to where you are based. So the site-specific nature of this seems important.
Interesting. Yeah, thanks, Neelam. Any other thoughts?
In our group, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just to respond to Neelam, I think it's your name. I think in a way we talked about the same thing, but also a bit opposite, in the sense that, yeah, it's the contestations that you discuss are site specific, but at the same time, they are everywhere. So like to separate out or to identify specific sites that are sites of conscience or sites of contestation is a bit dangerous in a way, in the sort of like that kind of maybe shows that other sites aren't, and especially because a lot of work that goes on around sites of conflict or contestation are very specific geographies, right? So why Newcastle is as much a site of conflict if you dig into its history and the way it's mobilized at the moment as many other places. So to kind of separate out those geographies and kind of, yeah, it's place specific, but also it's everywhere, and therefore maybe not so specific.
Great. Nick, you had something.
Yeah, well, in our group, something that I thought was really interesting that was mentioned by our participants both in Argentina and Colombia was this idea that there's a tension in sites of conscience between a kind of a danger of institutionalization and relationship with sort of social movements. And the idea was very much that one of the questions about future action, it depends on who's acting through these sites. And, you know, colleagues from both of those places suggested that they thought it was really important that there was this continued kind of relationship with social movements in an attempt to avoid becoming the establishment, if you like.
Great, thanks. Our very strong Latin American network has, I would say, the strongest connection with contemporary social movements of any of our regions in a lot of ways. So it's not a surprise that colleagues from Argentina and Colombia shared that. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I suppose we kind of touched upon kind of the disruption or positive disruption of COVID-19, as whether kind of something like an event like COVID-19 can actually kind of encourage action that otherwise it was not a priority before, or it was thought as not kind of feasible. And I think that I mean, we didn't quite complete the conversation, but we're getting to this point as to whether a disruptive event can actually disrupt some of the kind of common ways of engaging with these issues and provide ways of thinking differently.
So interesting, right? Sounds like much more a conversation to be had. So it's really great to hear how many great connections and ideas and kind of cross-cutting conversations are beginning to happen. But now I'm going to pass it over to Chris for our next group of questions and provocateurs. Chris, it's all yours.
Thanks very much, Linda. I wasn't quite ready for you to pass over to me because I was still mulling over all of the stuff that we talked about in our in this last session. I was particularly struck by what Lois said about, in a sense, where do you draw the lines around a site of conflict? If we think of, you know, those of us who are based in Newcastle can think about that in relation to, you know, histories of arms dealing and how that has configured our public space, for example, including the names that we give to our university buildings. But that's an aside. Let's not go too far in that direction. Okay, so I'll get straight into the questions. So our first question that we wanted to pose in this second session is, what role can sites of conscience play in immediate post-conflict settings? And again, I think, you know, we're happy for these, for us, for speakers and for all of our participants really to speak back to these questions and to unpick the terms. And I think that's one of the helpful discussions that we're having here. So what role can sites of conscience play in immediate post-conflict settings, whatever we mean by, you know, a range of terms that we can see in that question. So can I ask Jose to begin, please?
Muy buenos días. El Centro de Memoria, Paz y Reconciliación. Me alegra saludar.
Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here, to be very brief because we don't have a lot of time. I believe that nowadays we are very clear on the fact that the post-conflict period is not really a post-period that implies having reached peace. It means periods of a lot of tension where disputes are alive because of the historical telling and also because of the content and the reason for being of peace. We're going to discuss sites of consciousness, and there are three main functions. The first one is that in a scenario where a peace agreement has been signed, a site of conscience is a place to keep the reason for being for peace, facing the tensions that arise so that post-conflict will give us strategies to turn victims in a reason to bring war back. After signing a peace agreement, pictures of victims is a way to bring the war back. People think that the stories of victims is something that contributes to peace. Now, peace agreements are not just opinion disputes. They are not opposite opinions. There are true strategies executed against peace, against memory. And I think that sites of consciousness are there to see what is weakening society, the capacity to mobilize, and how victims and survivors can mobilize. Sites of conscience have to face that strategy. And after signing a peace agreement or after a conflict has been closed, there is always an argument that human rights organizations don't need any more resources, that they don't need to be there to close that. And sites of conscience have to face that. Also, a site of conscience has to realize that the tensions after a conflict process are post tensions that need social non-violent action. In other words, we cannot say that social action shouldn't be there to legitimize facts. After signing a peace agreement, society is not going to remain passive, and a side of conscience has to state that our history, that conflict and tragedy affirms that there has to be non-violent mobilization. And the conclusion is that we need to look for non-violent social protest. I think those three actions correspond to sites of conscience.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jose. Lots of really complex points there for us to take forward about mobilization. I'm going to turn straight away to Nayat from the Hranting Foundation. Nayat, can you take over?
Yeah. And thank you. And when we first started, thinking about how to create a side of conscience that could foster empathy, mutual understanding, peace, and dialogue, we started exploring different functions of sides of conscience. But at this point, I would like to brief you about 23.5 Hranting Site of Memory, which is located in Istanbul, Turkey. It used to be the former office venue of the Armenian newspaper Agos that was established by Hranting. And the establishment of the newspaper was a hope for the Armenians and minorities in Turkey as the issues related to this conflicted past started to enter into public agenda. And unfortunately, over the course of time, Hranting became a target and he was assassinated right in front of the newspaper building. So we felt a responsibility to turn that place into a site of memory and conscience. And while shedding light on this tragic political assassination, we are trying to shed light on his vision and the values that was embraced by the newspaper and Hranting, such as peace building, dialogue, democracy, human rights. But what we have learned over the course of time, of course, when I see this question, I also think about the ongoing conflicts and also conflicts in progress as well in a society, because Turkey is now becoming a more of a polarized society, and there are much more divisions than the past. But what we have learned over the course of years is that sides of conscience are more of a question rather than answers. And those questions play an important role in having a deeper understanding of the past, in truth seeking, and in also comprehension. Some of the visitors revisit the site, and while doing so, they revisit and question what they have been taught, the dominant narrative, the ongoing conflicts, and the discourse and discriminatory acts of the people around them. And also this question brought a quote of Hranting to my mind. I will read it. Perceptions on both sides can only change in an environment of contact and dialogue. Therefore, solving history is not actually a real concept or a problem. There is nothing to be solved about history anyway. There is only a part of it that has to be understood. And understanding needs a process of learning, enlightenment, and comprehension spread out over time. So we can also view those sides of conscience as sides of conversation and understanding. And by visiting those sites, we in fact show willingness to know and to start the process of different encounters and learning. It is truly important to create a site in terms of, like, you know, if it's talk about conflict prevention or, like, you know, confidence building, which talks with people rather than talking to people, to shift from to with, and the possibilities of communication, conversation, and dialogue make those sites meaningful, transformative, and can play a role in solving the conflicts. But in the long term, we cannot expect a change all of a sudden. And also, they can build responses for some, you know, divisions and dilemmas that we are having. And they can act as spaces for communication, reconciliation, and reflection, and especially engaging the visitors and providing a space for them to, like, you know, express their opinions, you know, the wishes, imaginations for the future hold a special importance. And I would say that, in the lastly, the dimension of hope also occupies an important place, because despite all the negativities, it is vital not to put the visitors into despair, but instead we should remind them that their acts, their efforts for awareness raising can spark change and transformation. So especially in the post-conflict societies, those sites can, you know, function as a meeting point to introduce people to each other, to talk together, and to try to be part of the solution.
That's great. Thank you, Nayat. And really loved the virtual commemoration activities around Hrant Dink recently. Ian, can I pass over to you? Great to have you with us. Over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Lovely to see everybody. Hola a todas, todos. So I just to give you a little bit of background, I'm not a museologist, but a musicologist. And so a lot of my thinking has been based around thinking about sound. But one of the areas that I'm very interested in my work on memory work in the Holocaust is the idea that memory work is also work of performance. So I wondered to what extent we might want to think about addressing this question of what role can sites of conscience play in immediate post-conflict settings, is to think about the way in which a site of conscience elicits certain modes of performance. If you look at someone visiting Dachau or Auschwitz, for example, what you get a sense of is a very particular way in which both the managers of the site and those visiting the site are, in some sense, entering into a kind of performative relationship in which they behave in certain kinds of ways. And I thought it's very telling. Recently, there's quite a lot of debate around the Holocaust Memorial site in Berlin, where allowing your children to run wild and jump between the great pillars has caused quite a lot of hostility from some people visiting the site. So the notion that sites elicit a particular kind of ritualistic relationship with memory it is also, it seems to me, usefully understood in terms of theories of performativity. Perhaps Judith Butler's work on performative theories of assembly might be helpful there. Of course, sites often evoke atrocity and victimization, but they thereby also, I would argue, enable forms of identification. What marks a site of conscience out from any other kind of site is precisely that invitation to identification. That's not to say that one, you know, gives up any kind of critical relationship with the narrative that the site is seeking to enact, but nonetheless, this notion of identification, I think, is very helpful. What's striking also, I think, is that quite a few people have mentioned already today, and I found very powerful, is the idea that sites of consciousness can refigure what we understand about victim groups. Victim groups can become, when sites of consciousness are well used, shall we say, victim groups can reassert their humanity, their status as a cultural being, and so on. So thinking about cultural practices of those brutalized at these sites is a way to not reduce victims to simply that act of violence, but to expand on that. And I know that quite a few places are looking at, Auschwitz, for example, has a music program and a literature program, and Srebrenica, I know, has developed new kinds of relationships with online materials dealing with poetry and memory work through literature. And I think through that process of recognizing victims as more than simply victims, but beings that had and have agency, that enables us to think about sites to be both located and distributed, so that they are both, on the one hand, dealing with a very specific geography of atrocity, if you like, but on the other hand, they are asking us and inviting us to connect that specific geography of atrocity to broader questions about our own humanity, our own status as cultural beings. And again, this takes us back to questions of identification. It's complicated identification because that's often used as a cover for, mute, glib, empathic narratives, which don't always really get to the heart of the complex, politics of memorialization. But I do think that the best sites of conscience enable this kind of dialectic of location and distribution, and that's quite unusual in most kinds of places. Other kinds of places don't really have that multi-layered function. So in a sense, that specific function of a site of conscience is, I would argue, very helpful in an immediate post-conflict settings, which I don't believe I addressed just now. So my apologies. That's me done.
Thank you, Ian. Brilliant. Last but certainly not least, Catherine Gilbert, can you take over?
Thanks, Chris. It's been wonderful to hear all of the different viewpoints coming through today. And one of the things I think it's bringing home for me is the importance of understanding the specificity of each post-conflict setting. And I've got this on my mind at the moment because I've just been reading a book called The Past Can't Heal Us, The Dangers of Mandating Memory in relation to human rights. And I've been thinking about whether these moral standards of remembrance that we hold, that the international community holds nations to what extent has that become prescriptive, and to what extent is there still freedom for different communities to find their own ways of remembering, that developing their own sites of conscience. That's just a sort of initial provocation. But all that to say, my own research actually focuses on the commemoration of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. And I think the Rwandan case is really interesting in showing the crucial role that sites of conscience can play in immediate post-conflict settings. One of the primary and I suppose ongoing consistent forms of memorialization in Rwanda is the conversion of these sites of atrocities into memorials. So there are numerous sites of massacres across the country that have been preserved as memorials. And these function as a place for survivors to go and mourn the dead, but also as sites of education, so to teach about the history of the genocide and to promote reconciliation, both for Rwandans and for international visitors to these sites. But they also, in the Rwandan context, serve as a stark reminder of the reality of the genocide. So they play this almost evidentiary role, and they act as a sort of proof, if you will, of the atrocities that have been committed in order to combat genocide denial, which sadly is very much on the rise in the world at the moment. Some of you may be familiar with the Murambi Genocide Memorial, for example, where some 2,000 bodies have actually been preserved and displayed as they are in the classrooms of this school, where the slaughter of 50,000 people occurred in 1994. And this has provoked heated debates, and these debates are ongoing, around the ethics of displaying the bodies in this way, on the one hand, and the pressing need to explicitly show what happened on the other hand. But what I want to talk about for the remainder of my time here is my current project, which focuses on the Rwandan diaspora. So I'm working with Rwandan communities based in Belgium, France, and the UK. And I've been reflecting a lot recently on how communities develop their own memorial practices when they do not have this direct connection to the specific sites of violence and of mourning. And what I found is there's a very public side to commemoration in the Rwandan diaspora. So this takes the form of official ceremonies, organized walks of remembrance, and also a push to create physical monuments. So there are now a handful of physical monuments to the genocide in Rwanda that have been built in Europe. And this makes the presence of survivors visible in the host community and raises awareness of the history of the genocide. And this is particularly important in sites such as Belgium, which is the former colonial power, and France, whose government actually supported the genocidal regime back in 1994. And also because there are very vocal forms of genocide denial in both of these countries among certain Rwandans and sadly among French and Belgian intellectual and political elites. So this claim to public space, this carving out of sites of conscience in the diaspora is really important for Rwandan communities who are actively seeking the recognition of their experiences. And I think their push for increased visibility on both French and Belgian soil poses significant challenges to dominant historical narratives. And it reminds us that this idea of a post-conflict setting expands far beyond one country's national borders and covers a much broader temporal period as well. So I'll stop there for now.
Brilliant, thanks, Catherine. Really interesting. I think we are due to move into breakouts. We're running a little bit behind, but are we still allowed 10 minutes?
Yeah. Well, maybe 8 minutes.
Maybe 8 minutes, all right.
Rooms are open.
Okay, see you all soon.
Hi again. Oh, it's so interesting. It gets slightly different people each time.
Got Sana twice, yay.
Okay, so Sana, I haven't gotten you before. It's very nice to meet you.
It's my lucky day.
Oh, so many good people to talk to. Don't you wish we were all in a physical room together?
I know. Oh, it's so, I mean, mind you, I do think these breakout rooms do allow for quite concentrated conversation in a way that if we were all standing in a room, you know, we might be distracted and
True.
So
True.
there is a slight advantage to this, although, you know, in human terms, it's
right. We pivoted pretty quickly to virtual work at the coalition because we'd already done it to some degree already.
Sure.
And we are huge believers in breakout rooms as a necessary function, you know, which is really great. So Sana, tell me, I'm interested in hearing what you do as well. I want to hear a little bit about why you chose to come.
I'm from Iraq. I think that says a lot in itself.
Yes, it does say a lot in and of itself.
The whole country is a site of everything, really. So yeah, you know, I came here in 2002. So that's 19 years ago with my family. My husband was doing his PhD. 1 year in, the war started, the latest war. I have to specify. I've personally been through so many since I was a child. And we had to recalculate our lives and decided to stay here. I'm an architect by profession, so I had to go through the whole thing of requalifying, you know, because I'm not recognized as an architect here. That was really tough. A year in, the 2003 invasion happened, and we were here with no contact with our family for months until my parents managed to phone. You know, that was a horrendous time in our life. So war is pretty much, you know, very central to my life.
Yeah, a fact of your life.
And you know, my dream of a PhD had to wait because we had to reestablish our lives. But in 2014, I started my PhD, you know, the long dream. And I'm looking at, if you know Gertrude Bell, if you're familiar with Gertrude Bell.
Actually, I
So,
watched that not very good movie about her not very long ago.
Many versions, but yeah, I think I'm the first to actually, you know, link her to architecture, because I found how much influence she had on the architecture of Iraq. But I find it very controversial. She's a controversial person for me, a colonial figure, and
but
purely
I
colonial.
find it so interesting to have someone who thinks about intangible things. Ian, you're holding, right, as you think about sound, and an architect, the most tangible things. To have the two of you in a room together is super interesting.
I was so lucky to be Dr. Biddle's student in the PhD, and you know.
Stop.
No, honestly, the Foucault lecture was the first, and I thought, you know, you set the bar a bit too high for everyone else after you.
Oh my God. Now you're
I still
embarrassing.
have that lecture, believe it or not. I still
Really?
have it. It's
Wow. Okay.
fantastic, and I've revisited many times.
So it's interesting. One of the things I think about, we've just finished a little project with the Yazidi people, actually, talking about a proposed memorial and museum. It's a long ways down the road. But we've done some virtual community consultations. And it's so interesting because there's conversation about what a physical memorial is like, whatever. But then the sense about what should be in a museum that's a memorial, but about the genocide. The clear, Ian, but they absolutely want some of the things you talk about, which is in this way. They were like, yeah, but if we're just about the genocide, like we're about so much more. We want to talk about the intangible heritage parts of our culture.
Yes, definitely. I mean, it's so complex there. It's so painful as well. And I think what many people don't realize, for us Iraqis, I always say that, you know, the really horrible images we saw of the so-called ISIS demolishing Assyrian sites in Mosul, the dress they were wearing, no one in Iraq dresses like that. So we perceive it as an external attack, whereas the world portrays it as, you know, fanatics within the same city.
Right.
People from Mosul don't see it that way. You know, these are foreigners who came and attacked and damaged and killed the Yazidis, and they were just, even the language apparently, because my mother's cousin lives in Mosul, and they took control of the city, but they were almost like thugs from all around the world who just descended on the city overnight. And sometimes they communicated in other language other than Arabic, because they are from all over the world. So that's the thing, you know. I think it's important for whoever is documenting that to realize it's not an internal oppression. It's something far more complex and big. I'm not saying Iraqis were innocent completely. You know, a lot of them actually joined ISIS, but it's not purely a sectarian or a religious conflict. The Yazidis have been there for thousands of years. You know, they would have all been killed if it was that bad. You know, it's
right. And it's, I have to say, it's so interesting. I mean, Catherine's work on the diaspora she was talking about from the Rwandan genocide. I think this idea that all of these, in some ways, all of these things are global now, you know, and it's the performative aspect, Ian. I mean, the whole idea that, you know, we can see those stupid selfies from Berlin, right? We can all see them now any day.
Yeah, that's right. And for me, what's interesting about that is those kinds of, that's where I think contestation comes back into it, is that, you know, sites and our imagination of these sites are always kind of linked to certain kinds of behavioral expectations about, you know, sites of almost ritualistic spaces in a way. And I think that's where sites of consciousness are really interesting, because that ritual is that link between the particular and the general. It allows
Right.
that process of generalization,
And that I've been at that site in Rwanda that Catherine talked about with the bodies on display, but I've also been in Cambodia in killing fields, right? And so the ritual nature, part of what's great about us as an organization, we respect whatever decisions affected communities make.
That's
As
very
long as there's a
important.
broader connection, because those are always different.
I can't, just to tell you how important that is. For example, one of the really important mosques in Mosul that has been demolished. Now the UNESCO there's an international architectural competition to redesign it, we're not sure what's going to happen. But people in Mosul are very, very angry. There's no one from Mosul on the board. So they feel excluded from the conversation. There are two token Iraqis who haven't been living in Iraq for the past 30 years who are on the board. And that's no good. You need to really involve the people who are, so the Yazidis, they have a say in what kind of...
Right. Hence why I sat in on a bunch of kind of Zoom in translation conversations.
They are the main voice that needs to be heard, rather than...
And I think
UNESCO
that's a hallmark as an Sites of Conscience is a broad term, but as an organization, a hallmark of our work is that community involvement.
Absolutely.
Always.
Absolutely.
We kind of hate it when people come to us with projects and it's so clear they hadn't talked to anyone. So, all right. I think we are headed back in 7 seconds. So, all right. Thanks, you guys.
I'm so lucky.
Okay, welcome back. I think everyone's back in the room, more or less.
Chris, just a quick reminder, one of the features of Zoom is that every time we go into a breakout room and come back, you have to reselect language interpretation. So, for everybody.
Thanks, Braden. Okay, so let's pile in straight away to the next question in the interests of time. And we'll do the same as we did before and have a fuller group sort of discussion after these that can perhaps kind of comprehend both of the questions and the points that we've been talking about. So our question now, and I'll do this in the same order with the speakers if you don't mind, is in what ways can alternatives to place-based sites of conscience build a more just future? And I think there we need to think about what those alternatives might be. I mean, it can be when we are dealing with cases of diaspora where memory communities have been displaced from sites of importance to them. It can be about intangibles like music or other forms of cultural practice. So look forward to hearing various perspectives on that. Jose, can we start with you again, please?
Sí, claro.
Yes, of course. I would think that in general terms, the main challenge is around building sites of conscience or memory museums or whatever you may call them that invite and do not exclude. And by saying this, I don't mean to say the obvious, because it's not obvious that sites of conscience are inviting and not exclusive. It's not obvious because a site of conscience might be exclusive very easily as it presents and holds activities that differentiate between those who were affected by the conflict and the rest of society. So as narratives are supported, narratives in which sometimes the take is that sites of conscience are for the victims and those who are not victims feel as though they are the others. I think that's where the challenge lies in sites of conscience. It's about breaking down that narrative and allowing all of society and all of the visitors, domestic and foreign and on all social levels, etc., to understand that the history of human rights violations is part of a general legacy, despite being incorporated in specific subjects, and that the dangers of the present and we were just talking about this in a group, about how sites of conscience are historical sites for the present. And when it comes to the present, it's about making that conscience persist over time. And there can be many approaches. And you can think of many ways of building that invitational capacity. Here at the center, we have artistic training centers, we have a research division, etc. And all of them are geared towards having these inviting activities under that same notion. And we are kind of shying away from doing mostly aesthetic or even artistic events that have that dividing line to them. When there is that dividing line, there's a sense that the past is the past, and then the visitors to the sites of conscience are mostly spectators of a past that is already gone. So I think sites of conscience should make the visitors become involved in future action. And I really like this phrase from Santayana, who used to say, the people who do not know their history are condemned to repeat it. And I think that goes together with another phrase that has to do with Auschwitz, that we have to know history so that there isn't another Auschwitz. So it's really about becoming involved, engaging, and for that we need to create the tools so that the visitors actually do engage and do get involved, at least in thought, in their mobilization. And by mobilization, I mean more than just a massive protests, and there are different ways of mobilizing at every level. But with that, there are many methodologies to be used. And we could talk about methodologies maybe on another occasion, but that basic change in mindset determines many things. One of them being that memory isn't just the memory of pain and suffering. That not all of society feels, but it is about history that does involve everyone in their respective contexts, together with the social struggles that have fostered democracies. So I think the main core of the ideas being conveyed isn't just about pain and suffering, but it's also about being able to resist human rights violations. That also has to be shown and presented in that light. And to be inviting, ultimately, it's not about creating sites of conscience or centers of memory with this closed history that cannot be talked about. We have to understand that sites of conscience have to tie together with other issues. It's not about twisting history, but it's definitely about connecting with history and asking questions about it. And there are sites of conscience when there's really not much to ask, because by conscience we're understanding it in those cases as kind of sanctifying the past. It's not that it's a sacred past, but it's our past. It's what we're capable of doing. We're capable of reaching a moon, but we're also capable of building concentration camps. That's humanity, and that has to be understood when visiting sites of conscience.
Great, thank you, Jose. Really interesting reflections. I'm going to pass on straight to Nayat, so we can keep relatively to time. I'm aware that I've missed a break, but we'll see if we can recoup that. So Nayat, over to you, please.
Thank you. Again, I will try to talk about different functions of the sites of memories. Of course, for building a just society, the public programs, the learning programs of the sites of conscience play a crucial role to promote human rights, a right-based approach, and to contribute to the skill development of their audiences for working towards a society where justice, peace, and equality prevail. And also we should bear in mind the importance of the archives, because most of the sites of conscience, they make the archives accessible and available for their audiences, which trigger interest from different professions like the researchers, the artists, journalists. They benefit from them, and they produce new production dealing with the difficult histories. So it has a multiplier effect, and I think opening the archives really holds a special importance. And those sites are also sites of activism and truth-seeking and justice-seeking. And these are also the sites of resistance, as mentioned many other colleagues, as Aleida Asman describes, the act of remembrance is a form of resistance, because with the sites of conscience, we resist against the politics of oblivion, social amnesia, the polarizations, and the divisions. And many sites in different parts of the world, in fact, there are sites of justice seeking. And I will give an example from our side as well, because justice seeking initiatives make the invisible visible and make the unheard audible. Like, for instance, the Hrant Dink assassination trial has been going on since 14 years. And during each commemoration, thousands of people gather to demand justice, to act against this injustice. And at the end of this month, they will end the trial. There will be a verdict, but unfortunately, the real perpetrators, they have not been brought to justice yet. But as long as the site stays, our activism for justice seeking will continue from 23.5. And as people shout out, the case will not be over until we say it is over. And also in terms of activism, I would like to share a little anecdote how those sites can transform the youth as well. Once there was a woman who brought her 15-year-old niece to our memory site, and she didn't have much knowledge about Hrant Dink or Armenian question. So she spent almost like 2 hours at the memory site listening to each and every content. And when she left, like, she had this expression on her face, like an appreciation, but she couldn't articulate her feelings that much. She left, and 5 minutes later, she knocked on the door and she asked whether she could take one of those round banners that are used during the commemorations, on which it writes, for Hrant Dink, for justice. And she said, I want to walk with it back home. So she felt the need to do something, to say something, to act. So within a span of like 2 hours, those sites can also become a transformation within the youth, especially I'm talking about the youth who doesn't know much knowledge about what happened in the past, because our school curriculum, you know, they just, you know, imposes a totally different narrative, let's say, depicting Armenians as enemies. So, and also we should encourage them to act. And at our memory site, we welcome and we say goodbye to our visitors with one of the quotes of Hrant Dink, saying that we are the people seeking to turn the hell we live into heaven. So we should remind them that despite all the darkness, there are people who are taking risks, who are sparking change, and that we should not give up. And we should never give up on reminding them that even a small step that we can take can plant seeds, but that can create change. And also we should remind them that they should water the plants that have already grown. So we regard each visitor as a messenger of the site, amplifying its meaning and its message. So that's all I can say now.
Thanks very much, Naya. Really interesting. Ian, over to you, please.
Thanks, Chris. So the question is how can alternatives to place-based sites of conscience build a more just future? And my thinking here is that the relationship between sites of conscience and other forms of memorialization is worth exploring before we can answer the question about building a more just future. So what I find very interesting in my own area, which is work on the Holocaust, is a tendency in the early aftermath amongst particularly Yiddish-speaking Jews to build portable memorials to lost communities. Perhaps the most widespread and intensive of these produced was the so-called Yizke-Buch, or the memory book. And these Yizke-Bücher, that's the plural in Yiddish, that were an attempt to assemble memories from either documents that they found that were written by memories of by people who were murdered in the Holocaust, or people who've survived who are recalling certain things. So there's old photographs, fragments of old diaries, images of people, pictures of, you know, buildings that have been lost. And what's striking in these memorial books is that they are quite ritualistic. In other words, they reflect in some interesting ways the kinds of ritualistic function of sites of conscience. Another example that I've recently been working on is the virtual shtetl. I don't know if anyone is familiar with this. The virtual shtetl is a site that I've had a little bit of input in. I'm not a designer. I've not authored most of the content, but I approached them about 6 years ago with an idea about enlarging their section on music. And of course, for those of you who don't know, the shtetl is a very particular kind of Jewish settlement. In the Pale of Settlement, Jews weren't allowed to live outside of cities of a certain size, yada, yada, yada. But what's interesting about the virtual shtetl as a kind of site of conscience, a website of conscience, if you like, is that it offers Jews that have connections to Eastern European, Ashkenazi Jewish experience, some sense of what the shtetl was like, but it doesn't shy away from the idea of Jewish existence, either secular or bound by religious beliefs, as quite tough and quite a difficult life, particularly when you're forbidden from living in cities and you have to eke out an existence based on very low levels of income, subsistence. So in a sense, this site, although in some sense seeking to celebrate this sort of cutesy, folklory shtetl imagination in so-called Yiddish land, is also a place that is seeking to get us to think about what exclusion and segregation, apartheid of a certain kind brings with it, the kinds of experiences that and how it impacts on the way our language works and so on. So what I find interesting in that and in other examples is that it is an imaginary site in a way. The shtetl is idealized often, romanticized in certain parts of the website, and yet in other parts of the website there's a push and a shove about how to think about these romanticizations as themselves kind of false reclamations of perhaps something that is not something that necessarily we want to reclaim. So of course what that opens up is a whole series of questions about one's origins in poverty, about identity as a form of exclusion as well as a form of inclusion. It opens up a whole range of ways of thinking about selfhood and community, which exceeds place in some very interesting ways. Perhaps another way of thinking about this would be to look at some of the recent publications in Yiddish. Again, I'm sorry to keep using Yiddish, but it's what I'm working on right now, and I think it is relevant. There's just been released in the last couple of years 2 amazing volumes on the Yiddish language, 2 very important dictionaries. Until about 5 or 6 years ago, we didn't have reliable scholarly dictionaries in Yiddish, and now we have these 2, fantastic. Do I have them here? No, I can't show them to you. And again, they act in a way as sites of memorialization for the notion of a standard, which Yiddish doesn't have, for the notion of a coherent linguistic space. And so part of what we might be thinking of in these terms is someone said to me recently that at last Yiddish has its own Duden. And those of you speak German, Duden you'll know is this fantastic series. I mean, it's there's no linguistic space that does it quite as well as Germans in Duden, but it's a highly rigorous past series of dictionaries for German language use and so on, synonyms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So my final point, because I know I'm running a little bit over, is to think about the relationship between sites of conscience, sorry, I do find that a little bit hard to say, and other kinds of practice, which are perhaps a bit more deterritorialized, more distributed, which could also function in similar ways, particularly because I work on music, and music is by its very nature intangible. I'm always looking for other ways of thinking about locatedness and sites and so on. So perhaps moving beyond the geography of atrocity towards something more to do with questions around how we value cultures that have been undermined or attacked or victimized or brutalized, how we enter into solidarity with those cultures above and beyond simply visiting sites of atrocity.
Thanks, Ian. I'll let you run over there because that was so insightful and fascinating. Okay, Catherine, can you give us the last word on this question? Thanks.
Great, yes. So as I intimated in my previous reflection, for me, commemoration goes very much hand in hand with education, and particularly educating the future generations to promote values of tolerance, reconciliation, and peace. So I want to propose education then as an alternative site of conscience. So to consider education and teaching as a site of conscience. And I'm sure this sounds fairly obvious, but the classroom is the place where most young people are first introduced to all of these difficult histories that we've been talking about. And I just want to give one very brief example from the research I'm currently conducting into teaching materials that are being developed by Rwandan community organizations based in Belgium. And this is like a side project coming out of my broader work on commemoration that came about because I couldn't actually do my field work due to the COVID pandemic. But the example I want to talk about is a small genocide survivor organization based in Brussels called Muira Arts et Mémoire, and they were founded in 2014. And while their primary activities are concerned with transmitting the memory of the genocide against the Tutsi, they explore creative pedagogical methods and develop tools for helping students to understand the crime of genocide more broadly, and also for equipping students to combat other forms of racism, xenophobia, sexism, and homophobia. So they've got a very broad pedagogical remit. But a couple of years ago, they produced this pedagogic resource that I'm just holding up to the screen here, D'ici et d'ailleurs, which consists of a DVD or a film that presents the testimonies of 5 genocide survivors living in Belgium. And this is accompanied by this livret pédagogique, so this pedagogical booklet, which provides additional historical context, as well as suggestions for how to use the testimonies in classrooms. So it gives concrete exercises and questions to work through with students. And this is high school, secondary level students. And it also, interestingly, based on the discussions we've had before, it situates the genocide in Rwanda alongside other genocides of the 20th century, such as the Herero in Namibia, also discusses Armenia, and of course, the Holocaust. And I wanted to talk about this example because I think it's important as it presents an understanding not just of the history of the genocide in Rwanda, but also the experiences of Rwandan survivors living in the diaspora and the specific challenges that they face. And this is particularly important in Belgium, where students need to be aware of students really need to be aware of these multiple experiences when they're learning about Belgium's colonial past and the impact that Belgian colonization had on the development of the genocidal ideology. And this ties into a much broader project of decolonizing the curriculum, which we actually touched upon in our breakout session. I suppose my provocation here then is that teaching history, particularly colonial history, has been very under-examined in Europe, and it certainly remains a point of contention in Belgian schools today and in other European countries, France, the UK, and so on. And while there are currently ongoing heated debates around how to revise the curriculum and what should be included, teachers in Belgium actually still maintain a certain amount of freedom to decide what to teach in their own classrooms. And this is driven by their own interests, for example, but also the extent to which they have sufficient knowledge of a particular topic and whether they actually feel confident enough to teach that topic with enough nuance and critical content in their own classrooms. So the result of this is students being exposed to different aspects of colonial history to different degrees, and some leaving high school without having any knowledge of it at all. So I want to make the case here for the importance of incorporating the history of the genocide against the Tutsi into the curriculum in European schools. Sadly, to date, teaching about or developing materials to aid teachers in their teaching about the genocide seems to be the work of motivated individuals and small collectives. So there's a lack of cohesion in existing initiatives, and these are led by a range of disparate organizations, many of which are charitable organizations, which comes with its own set of problems. But I just want to end then with a call for a much more sustained, widespread official policy for the teaching of this history and a rethinking or reinterrogation of the role of education more broadly as a site of conscience.
Thanks, Catherine. I think that links really nicely to Nayat's comments about learning as well, specifically in contexts where the learning that we're talking about is, you know, not authorized learning from the point of view of a state, for example. Okay, so I think we are now due to go into breakout discussions. In the interests of time, we decided to kind of forego the break, so we would put you through that. Although, of course, if people need to disappear momentarily, you know what to do. Just blank your screens and you know, come back and join in the discussions. So yeah, we're being split into groups now.
Why, hi.
Here we are again. Wow.
I know. So I put a bunch of links in the chat, Ian, because you know, one of the things I think is so interesting is that our name, Site of Conscience, is sometimes a little misleading about what our members do. So I put some of the links in which members have undertaken projects that are really similar to some of the kinds of things you're talking about, both virtual and others. You know, the memory boxes in Afghanistan are kind of an incredible project, like the kind of memory books you talked about, but they're physical, you know, kind of entities. The kind of map in Lebanon. I cannot find the link. We actually, the members in the Middle East and North Africa region have collectively done a virtual map of sites of human rights abuses in the region that's kind of created by them. Sana, you may be really interested as well. There are Iraqi sites on that list because it's really interesting because many of them are sites still in use, you know, as torture centers or prisons or whatever. Others of them they don't have access to. And I think this virtual world is a really interesting place to kind of live in our current days, but in the future as well.
Yes, it's almost like this is a sort of workshop in which we're being forced to quicken some of our investment in the virtual, isn't it?
Yeah.
And although, you know, it's driven us all crazy, I mean, it's driven me absolutely crazy being stuck at home. Nonetheless, I have to say that I've been really grateful for some of these sites, including your own, but many like them, where, you know, all of this richness and complicated, you know, contested materials enables you to really do some important field work, but to do it in a virtual way rather than, you know, out on the field, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, like you, I deeply miss travel.
Oh.
Right, in the worst way. But I think the kinds of materials that are now available and the fact that, you know, you can pretty much talk to anyone now.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm in a way, you know, you mentioned about travel. If you think most Iraqis since 1980, since the Iraq-Iran war, we were not allowed to
travel. Yeah.
So most of our archives are not in Iraq, and I just feel very, very privileged to be here and have access to that. But on the other hand, you know, these are our country's archives, and they shouldn't be, you know, Iraqis should have access to it. So I'm really happy, for example, that the Gertrude Bell archive is digital, because, you know, that I'm a strong believer in what Nayat said. You know, just the digital websites are a chance for people to revisit their own history, because it doesn't physically exist Iraqis still can't come here on a normal
Right.
visa.
Right. And it's really interesting. We have another member in Lebanon, who has been involved in a project, and I think one of our Latin American members also is. There's some organization, I think, in Germany that's all about getting organizations in places where archives are at risk to upload materials
absolutely
safely. Kind of incredible. And is sadly kind of, I mean, in their archives are at tremendous risk. Their founder was assassinated a month ago. You know, like it's a really difficult time, but they are just so committed. And, you know, NIAT as well, they work under some pretty restrictive conditions in Istanbul. And the idea that this stuff lives somewhere else is, you know, it's real testimony, right? That's really what it is.
Yes, I mean, I think the act of its distribution is part of what kind of cements the conscience, as it were, of the site in the first place. So that you not only you've got this kind of dialectic of location and, you know, generalization, if you like, but also of location and distribution.
Right.
And that's fundamental, it seems to me. You know, from the point of view of someone who's not Jewish, who doesn't have any family lost in the Holocaust, for me, this began, you know, my interest in the Holocaust began as a kind of intellectual process. But what's striking is that these sites of conscience draw you in, that you become part of a conversation about these kinds of community memories. And that's where I've become really interested in them, because they've enabled me to enter into conversations which perhaps I wouldn't have been able to enter into, you know, as a you know, someone whose family has lived in the United Kingdom as long as records, you know, go on for. We have no diasporic relatives. Everybody lives within 15 miles of where they were born, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very interesting for me to be a kind of you know, if you like, a virtual ally.
Yes.
To some of these
lovely
communities.
expression. I like that.
Yeah.
And I think it is, you know, it's also made it possible for us to, I mean, technology has made it possible for us to be virtual allies in other kinds of ways. You know, the Anne Frank Memorial in Boise, Idaho, one of our members was vandalized with Nazi insignia, you know, a couple months ago. And we held a Facebook Live with their director right away to kind of share out. And they had amazing community support pushing back against it, but it also is, you know, in some of the evaluation work we've done at the coalition, a big value is that ally sense. And that's not in person. We're not showing up with a protest sign in person, but it is the virtual ally. That's a really nice way to think about it.
Sana, I was going to ask you, in terms of, you know, your access to these archives, are Iraqis themselves able to access these virtually from Iraq, or is there restrictions to what they can?
Now there is access, so the restrictions have been lifted. But if you like, you know, in terms of all our you know, since Iraq was founded 100 years ago exactly, it was in August 1991, sorry, 21. Everything was censored, you know, firstly under the mandate, then, you know, all the governments that were still, you know, under the influence of Britain, then the Cold War influence, then Saddam Hussein, who just, you know, took control over everything and basically dictatorship. So, and now even post 2003, I feel everything needs to be revisited based on primary resources in Iraq, because we never had access to primary resources. You know, the stuff that has been released in the 1980s, you know, after 50 years of events in the British Library, for example, and Kew, I was amazed. You know, that's the history of my country lying there and nobody knows about it. So Iraqis don't have access to that.
Sure.
The Gertrude Bell archive is one rare example of Iraqis being able to access it. But then you have also the language issue. Not all of them can read English. But it's just, I feel our history written in Iraq has always been highly censored. And it's really time for it to be revisited and reassessed based on primary resources.
Yeah. But it just goes to show, doesn't it, that archives are always, you know,
relevant.
Yeah,
absolutely.
They're always
Yeah,
relevant. Also, they're always already implicated in systems of power,
yes,
aren't they?
They
You know,
are,
who has access,
very much.
and you know, who can speak the language that these archives operate in, and who are they addressed to, and for whom, and so on. It's really interesting, and I think very powerful stuff. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Great.
So yeah, hopefully everything gets digitized, and you know, I'm a strong, you know, believer in that. You know, I saw maps of Baghdad, of buildings. You know, I could find histories I was not aware of. When I studied in university, architectural history was just about describing, you know, how tall a building was, how wide, and nothing about, you know, the critical analysis of the context, the historical, the political context of it. And it's still the same, you know, they're still, just because everybody was tiptoeing around politics, nobody wanted to go there. And now is a chance, really.
Yeah, quite amazing.
Yeah,
Great.
we have a number of pure archives that are also members of the coalition for exactly that. The Guatemalan secret police archives.
Yes.
Just, like they found literally by opening a door one day, and there they were. Because we have discovered that repressive regimes love our documenting things.
Yes,
right?
They do.
It's like
They
so
do.
weird. You know, we also have a number of, in the US and Canada, archives related to residential schools for Native Americans, which are we're seeing more members, and that's a critical issue about access and power there as well.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, really interesting. All right, we're closing. Great conversations, everyone.
See you
Find a
guys.
less sunny spot.
Yeah.
Okay, welcome back in the room, everyone. I hope you had some good discussions in your groups. I did. So now we have, just as we did before, 10 minutes just to kind of hear from the larger group about key points, maybe really interesting discussions that happened in your group, or concepts or ideas that really struck you. So I'll shut up and see if there are any takers, anyone who wants to contribute or say something. I can see Ian's hand up straight away.
Thanks, Chris. I was just going to share that, you know, one obvious way I think is outreach as a place-based, and we were talking about almost, you know, a dual strategy, that, you know, something that is site-based using the power of that site, but again, particularly where outreach can involve people who've got that real first-person connection, you know, those people maybe going out and reaching out, and it could be sort of local or much more distant communities, but sharing those messages. And I was just sharing the experience that I'd had visiting the Anne Frank exhibition for the first time, which I happened to see in Watford, of all places. But what I remember about it is not the fact it was in Watford, but the fact that one of the volunteer interpreters was somebody who'd come across on the Kindertransport, and he sort of showed us a photograph of his school group in Berlin in the 1930s, and then showed us how few of those people had survived the Holocaust. So it was that, although it wasn't place-based, it was the personal connection. So I think people as well as places and outreach to me are obviously parallel strategies to sites of conscience.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, it raises really interesting questions about the deterritorial aspect that we were talking about before as well. Any other questions or comments, summaries? Ian, the other Ian Biddle.
Ianization of this afternoon. So I was just wondering whether anybody was familiar with any work that's been done on what I'm calling vernacular memorialization. So by that, what I mean is the kinds of things that happen every day in people's lives, pseudo ritualistic moments where people remember something or give account of something. So I remember one of my former PhD students was very much involved in feminist actions on the streets of Newcastle about reclaiming the city and so on. Of course, in the context of recent events in the UK, it's become quite resonant for me, and remembering some of the things that she was saying. And she talked about you know, certain places and spaces reminded her of you know, gender-based microaggressions against her, so that beyond the idea of you know, a formally, you know, a bounded space of conscience, maybe there are many spaces of conscience through which we're constantly walking over and over again without even realizing it. I just wonder if there's, in the context of this last question we've been posing, if there's a way of thinking about places of conscience that doesn't necessarily have to be bound to institutions and so on. Maybe there's a room for conversations about these sort of, I don't know, vernacular, you know, microaggression experiences, which are traumatic, problematic, difficult, and often connected to particular institutions and spaces, but they're not necessarily sites of conscience.
Thanks, Ian. People may have responses to that. I can see Lois, so I'll pass over to you, Lois, first. I've got something to say, but we can always talk about that, Ian, offline. But Lois, over to you.
Yeah, I would say our whole city is full of these kind of not really even microaggression sites, right? So a lot of the buildings in our cities are offensive in certain ways. A lot of the heritage, or what we consider heritage, have a very particular narrative around them of course, the winner who wrote our history, you know. So yeah, I think we, much more than we currently do, we need to look at it in this way. And for me, like, a question would be not necessarily like what is the stuff we need to protect in this sense, or, you know, if that's in the city or display in a museum or whatever, but it's more about who do we care for through caring for this heritage. So who are the people we center on, who are the people we think are important enough to somehow celebrate. And then, because if you talk about it in that sense, you also see, then you have to acknowledge that you don't care about these other people. And is that actually what you want? So I think it's the whole, we don't think about our cities in this way, or about our built environment in this way very much. And I think that's quite problematic, and it excludes a lot of people. It makes a lot of people uncomfortable, but those are not the people we care for it through our policies and our heritage listings and all this kind of stuff.
Nayat.
I want to give an example of a project we did at the foundation. It's a mobile app. It sheds light on the multicultural history of Istanbul. We started with Istanbul, but we will add other cities as well. Those sites are not directly sites of microaggression, but some sites are, you know, destroyed, and they are they vanish from the collective memory inevitably. So by shedding light to those alternative histories, an awareness happened within Istanbul, and more than 20,000 people downloaded the app. I can send you the link here, so you can also listen to content in English. And we want to continue those, because those are not named as sites of memories now, and they are now being used for different functions. Let's say an old Armenian school can be used as a gym center at the moment. But it's really, really important to remind that coexistence in the past and what has been destroyed. So we can also view them as sites of microaggressions. I will share the link in a bit.
Nayat, I already just put the link in the chat there, so
thank you.
Yeah, I have that app. I can recommend it. Yeah, I can't see any other hands right now. Please do jump in, Aaron.
Chris, well, you know, I can carry on from there. Because we got into a brief discussion about what about sites that don't exist anymore. You know, for example, Chris mentioned torture sites in the Middle East and North Africa, which have now been, removed from the record. But we also have things like that here in the UK. So I'm sitting in Northumberland, and I was sending them that I've been speaking to one of the MA students about, who's a photographer as well as a sort of an art student, that I used to drive around Northumberland with someone who knows Northumberland well. This is when I first arrived in the UK, and he would point out where there used to be mining sites and mining infrastructure. And when these mines were closed in I think in the 80s and 90s, primarily, those sites were just landscaped out of existence. So if you go through Northumberland now, you would, and you don't know about this, as I wouldn't have known if this hadn't been pointed out to me. You know, these were sites where maybe there was, you know, underage labor, people died, people were oppressed, but you'd have absolutely no appreciation that they were there in the first instance. So there'll be a lot of places like that, not just here and in the Middle East, but all over the world. And what does one do with sites like that? So in a way, it slots in, it will follows on for what Nayat was saying.
Thanks. That's really useful. I mean, we can wrap up this discussion and move on to the next part in a minute, but I was just wanting to sort of reflect on some of the challenges of that, really, because obviously in heritage studies and heritage practice, we've been battling for decades against a kind of monumentalized idea of heritage with all of the problems and the power relations or power geometries that brings with it. And what we're talking about here in terms of sites of conscience in some senses is, you know, can a site of conscience be somebody's memento, displaced person's memento or something like that? Can it be a site that's been erased? Can it be something that isn't monumental and something that's minor and everyday? Can it be something that's not recorded? So I think that's a kind of a theoretical and political and technical challenge that's really interesting for us to think about, maybe together between Newcastle and the coalition as we go forward. It's kind of a hard question, and I certainly don't have a sort of easy set of answers to it. And I can see how administratively for an organization like the coalition, you know, you might, it might end up being an unmanageable kind of expansion of the concept. So those are interesting kinds of questions. Braden or Linda, I don't know if you want to say anything about that before we move on.
Sorry, I have to say, I believe that every single place can be a site of conscience. I actually believe that, which is far beyond the ability of our current 22 people staff to cope with every single place in the world being a site of conscience. But I think, you know, whether I live in upstate New York and, you know, I live somewhere where there were, you know, milk strikes and anti-rent strikes in the 1840s and, you know, poverty and environmental issues, right? They exist everywhere. But I think what when an organization, and we only take organizations as members, become a member of Sites of Conscience, we ask that they sign a statement of principles, which is 4 things. One, that they think about place, but place, we have chosen over the 21 years in our existence to think about place really broadly. It might be Rwanda, but it might be the Argos office, right? The places, we are very size agnostic about how we think about place. Another is that those, you know, when you think about those 4 truths, particularly those personal truths really matter, and that there are opportunities to share those truths. The third is that there are opportunities for positive action, which is what makes us different than some places that are just memorials, right? Our goal is memory to action. And the fourth is that as a site, you embrace the concept of universal justice and human rights. So those are our only 4 criteria. We don't care how big you are. We don't care whether you're an arm of a government or you're not an arm of the government. But if you can agree as an institution on those 4 principles, then we find room for you in our big tent. Braden, do you have anything to add to that?
You got it. That's all good.
So yeah, we can get bigger, Chris. No problem.
That seems like a good point to move into an abridged version of our kind of final full group discussion. If you look back at the agenda that was posted in the chat at the very beginning, or if you have it next to you already, you can see that we set ourselves an easy question, which is how can we deepen the transformative impact of sites of conscience at whatever scale now, and I suppose in whatever form we take that to mean, making a difference in the world and ensuring equity, equality, which however you want to put it. So I think that's something that we can look at a theoretical level, but it's also something that I'm interested in terms of this particular collaboration. As I mentioned at the beginning, you know, this workshop is really the beginning, or it's part of the development of you know, an institutional partnership where we try to put our forces together for good in ways that we couldn't achieve alone. So I'm interested in, you know, if people may have kind of theoretical or practical ideas about how sites of conscience can become more effective for a better world, but I'm also interested in the kind of institutional level thinking, if people do have suggestions about how collectively as institutions we can join forces to achieve that. So I know it's a big ask, and it's getting late and people are tired and we've had no break. But if people do have ideas about that, if people have comments, then really, really welcome that in these last sort of 15 minutes or so.
Chris, if I may.
Of course.
Thank you. So I actually think that the process of this assembling, again, going back to theories of assembly, I'm always the theorist in the room, I'm sorry, but I do think it has practical implications. Going back, I think it was Catherine's point about praxis. It was you, Catherine, was talking about praxis, is that right? I think it was you, or maybe it was Nayat, I'm sorry. Who was talking about praxis? I can't remember. Anyway, sorry, I'll come back to that. Lisa, my apologies that she's left us, that's right, yeah, she's had to go. So, you know, the very fact of building a network is you know, already part of this process, and it's not, and that's not just going to do its work on its own. But I do think today's event has brought me together with just colleagues, even in Newcastle, I didn't know were working on areas that are very close to my own. I had no idea. And this is what happens in big institutions like universities, isn't it? We just can't see each other. So at that level, today's been extremely useful. Secondly, I would say that at another level, which is the level of connecting us in Newcastle to all these other colleagues working extraordinary, particularly Linda and her team, you know, this is, you know, such a valuable opportunity to network and also to learn and improve our own practice, and also to, you know, shamelessly steal ideas, because in the end, you know, this is all for the good, isn't it? We're working hard to think about, you know, ways of affecting repair and mending broken communities, and you know, intervening in inter-community relationships in productive and engaging ways that take account of our complex and contested heritage. So that's not really an answer, it's just a bit of a cheer for everybody, sorry.
We'll take the cheer, Ian, for sure. Anybody else have other, we posed a question and now we're kind of like, oh, a question. See, it sounded really good when we wrote the agenda. Other kind of reflective thoughts from anybody about what you came expecting and what you got? We can begin to frame a question that way.
I can see David and Nayat.
It was kind of a brief thought on the last question, because one of the things that we ended up talking about in our smaller group just the last sort of breakout bit was the role of education and the role of teaching. And although we were focused really, or I think our discussion was around sort of primary school, or well, school level teaching, I think one of the things, responding to Chris's question about what can be brought by this kind of institutional partnership, is that there's been a lot of a lot of discussion in these groups, and with the internships around sort of research possibilities that can come from the partnership between the university and the coalition. But I'm wondering what possibilities there are that could be that lead on from that, in terms of how do the goals or the ambitions of the coalition as a human rights organization then feed into the form of teaching and the kind of teaching that we're delivering at Newcastle University, and whether it can influence that. So I'm wondering, it's a thought and question more than anything else at the moment.
Thanks. And Naya, you had something.
Yeah, I would say, like, I think this network is very important. And the other aspect which can empower our work is just to build alliances and solidarity with each other, because we are dealing with similar issues, although we are in different geographies. The problems that we are dealing are very much the same. And I think, like, peer-to-peer learning is very important. And, like, rather than producing materials from zero, I know, like, many of you have produced amazing materials in terms of, like, learning programs, public programs. We can think about, adapting those materials to our own work rather than producing them from zero, because there's an amazing and valuable experience in here. And I think, like, we have to build those cooperation and alliances and do work together.
So Ian Watson, I'm going to call on you in a minute, but I do want to note that Naya, before they opened the Hrad memory site, visited many sites of conscience and memory sites around the world and produced a great publication about what she learned. Naya, if you can, is it on your website? Can you put a link in the chat room?
Yes, sure.
It's like such a great resource. I highly encourage everyone to take a look. Ian Watson.
Thanks. It's actually a bit of a parallel point to what Nayat was saying. It was a question really, to what extent do you work with other networks like the Federation of International Human Rights Museums, and to what extent are there other networks with shared areas of interest where we could strengthen by working together? And maybe a lot of that happens already, and it may be that I'm not aware of it, but I didn't know how that sort of played out in the ecology.
We don't have formal partnerships with any organization. As you know, we're not purely a museum network, which, Federation of Human Rights Museums is, so that makes us a little different. We're an affiliated organization of ICOM, so we kind of live a little bit in that weird place that affiliated organizations live within ICOM, which is, engaging in those conversations and partnering with some of the international committees. So in that way. So yeah, our relationships are informal, and as they appear, I guess, is the best description of them. And to be honest, many of them have had a greater US based, North American base, because that's where we're based. And one of the great things here is the opportunity to expand that more, both for us to learn and to provide additional opportunities for our members to connect and learn.
And just to reflect two ways that kind of practice lives in multiple spaces, because I also want to pick up on what David was asking, right? Part of the approach of the coalition is always that while we have things to share and learn with each other, and none of us is in this alone because we are working collaboratively around the world, every situation is unique. And so the question is always like, hey, what does this group and this moment and this place need? Right. And so we figure out whether it's a partnership, whether it's working with a site, whether it's working with a local government, right, whoever it is. The question is always like, what's the wind we can put in somebody's sails right here, right now, help that move forward. And in 2 years, it'll be something else. In 5 years, it'll be something else. Right. And David, you had said, hey, how does this reflect on Newcastle's teaching? That is a question that sites work on all the time. We spend a ton of time with people being like, hey, we don't give tours because we're a historic site, right? We give tours because that is the most powerful way to build change in the world, right? And getting that mind shift of trying to choose our tools to reflect the goals that we lay out and that we want to achieve, and not just falling into some kind of role play because we are a certain type of institution. It's a real and ongoing struggle that we have every day.
So thinking about sharing knowledge, the pot of money that financed this collaboration was policy related. So we got the money because we were able to say we were working with the coalition to think about how you might have impact on policy, either in terms of policy making bodies or policy through government. It was interesting, Lisa Lee had to go early because she was going to speak to the mayor. And I think in terms of what we can do usefully and how we might share knowledge, obviously policy contexts are completely different in different countries and within different countries. But I think there is an opportunity to think about how we impact and how we can change political discourse at local levels through sharing some of that knowledge. So and yeah, given that we had the money to think about how we might do that, that may well be something that we might want to pick up on after the workshops.
Other thoughts, anybody? I want to recognize at least one coalition member who kind of snuck in. Maybe there's more than one. Do I have Dennis Nagala from Manene Cultural Trust in Kenya, managed to squeeze in time to join us today. So thanks, Dennis, for coming for a bit. We also at one point had, although I think she's had to leave, Mina Watanabe from the Women's Active Peace Museum in Japan. So we managed to cover all of our continents today, which was really terrific. I want to give one reminder, Chris, and then maybe you get a chance to wrap up. How's that? We want to make sure you all come to the next conversation. We are doing another one of these in 2 weeks on the 24th. It'll be focused on dialogue.
Next
And Braden and Joanne will be taking the lead on that. And I particularly want to thank Braden for both supporting breakout rooms and my panic text at 7:15 a.m. this morning with the issue about getting the translator squared away. So you'll get to hear a lot more from him, from Dennis, who I think is also joining that, and other members about how we think about dialogue, along with some Newcastle faculty members as well. And yeah, so please join that. Joanne probably will send out a link to register. She hasn't already to Newcastle folks. We'll do the same for the coalition folks. And I also, before I let Chris wrap up, want to thank our translators who, as always, do yeoman work to make it possible for everyone to participate. So thanks, you guys, as always. Chris, I'm going to give you like 4 minutes.
I don't think I need that much, but thank you, Linda. I also wanted to thank the translators. I suppose I'll just wrap up by saying what we have at the moment is a peculiar window of opportunity. So as Joanne said, we were able to benefit from a small amount of funding that comes internally through the university. I won't get into the details of where exactly that comes from. And it is connected to impacting policy. So that is something that we might think about as we go forward, about how collectively we can do that and to better effect than we could alone. But it is also because, going back to Julie's words at the very beginning of the meeting, Newcastle University has, a proclaimed interest in global challenges in social and environmental justice. And so this burgeoning partnership, or us trying to make a partnership, is in a sense an attempt to make that into something concrete, or it's one of many projects, if you like, that are trying to concretize something which at the moment might seem quite abstract and at the level of university visions and rhetoric and this kind of thing. So what we're trying to do is figure out, well, what does it mean to actually talk together to make that happen, so that we can actually kind of exercise interests and effects upon social justice in the world in a caring way. And I think care is an important word for me, that might kind of guide some of our activity in this space. One of the things that we're kind of testing out in this is what problems does that bring with it institutionally, what kind of administrative, bureaucratic issues does it throw up? Because universities are very good at making partnerships, but generally with other universities, not necessarily with organizations like the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. So how can we actually make this way of working together the norm? And these are, as you can tell, these are open questions that we're trying to figure out, and also what the benefits are and what the added value, if you like, of this collaboration could be, is open for debate, and it's open for us to explore. So if people have wish lists, if they have great ideas, you really want to do X or Y or Z because there's a particular space there, whether it's to do with the curriculum, education, whether it's to do with research, whether it's to do with engagement, or making a difference in a particular part of the world or for a particular community, then please do let us know, because that's all grist to the mill in terms of developing the partnership. In terms of what's next, I mean, I think what we'll try and do is produce some kind of report from all of our meetings, from this one, from the next one, from the internships that are going on, and you know, turn that into something that can help us make a really effective partnership that has institutional purchase in all of the organizations concerned, that means something, that doesn't remain limited to even to this group of people, which is already large enough, but has a much wider meaning and significance institutionally, and kind of saturates the mindset, if you like, of the institutions and makes possible new things. So I just wanted to sort of give a few comments about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and to invite input and to invite comments, ideas, things that we haven't thought of. So please do get in touch with any of those. And I think that's probably all I wanted to say from the Newcastle side, other than I'm really, really grateful for everyone to making time, both in terms of academic colleagues at Newcastle, the coalition members who've joined us, obviously Linda and Braden, and last but certainly not least, the interns who are doing such important work now that we can also learn more about in future. So I just really want to thank you all. I know it's been a long event, but for us it's really important to explore this and to figure out what it can do. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for thinking with us, which is really what this was all about. It was great. So have a great rest of your day, wherever you are, everybody. Bye.